In 1962, a bewildered little Cuban boy was sent to the United States by his parents to escape communism. Today, that little boy is an esteemed historian, a chaired professor at Yale, and a best-selling author. Carlos Eire on Uncommon Knowledge now. Welcome to Uncommon Knowledge. Recording today at Yale University, I'm Peter Robinson. Born in Havana, Carlos Eire moved to this country at age 11 as part of Operation Peter Pan, the program under which some 14,000 Cuban children were sent to the United States by their parents between 1960 and 1962 to escape the communist regime of Fidel Castro. Professor Eire lived in a succession of temporary homes before settling in Chicago. Putting himself through school as a supermarket stock boy and a hotel dishwasher, Professor Eire earned his undergraduate degree at Loyola University in Chicago, then earned his doctorate here at Yale. For almost 30 years now, Professor Eire has taught here at Yale, where he is now the T. Lawrison Riggs Professor of History and Religious Studies. Professor Eire is the author of more than half a dozen works of history and 2 volumes of memoirs, including this first volume of his memoirs, Waiting for Snow in Havana, and his second volume, Learning to Die in Miami. Carlos Eire, thank you for joining us.
Oh, thank you for inviting me.
I may as well just say it, full disclosure to our viewers, I'm married to a Cuban. Your books have been read by every member of her family, all our children. It's mandatory reading in our household. As I've just mentioned, you've composed more than half a dozen works of medieval and modern history and 2 volumes of memoirs. These books have attracted prize after prize. Here we have, on this edition, National Book Award winner, and yet there is this on your biography on the Yale website, quote, "All of his books are banned in Cuba, where he has been proclaimed an enemy of the state, a distinction he regards as the highest honor of all."
Yes.
Explain yourself.
Well, it's the highest honor because it means that I'm opposed to one of the worst dictatorships on earth. But it's also the easiest honor to earn because all you have to do is speak out and to get attention when you speak out. And because this book won the National Book Award and I said some unkind things about the Cuban government at my acceptance speech.
There is no freedom to write. There is no freedom to read. Everything that the National Book Foundation stands for is negated in Cuba on a daily basis.
That's when I
see.
became an item on their list.
We'll come to Cuba again in a moment, but have you been back?
No, I can't go back.
You can't go back. That's what I was assuming.
As a matter of fact, I learned I was an enemy of the state, an official enemy, because the U.S. State Department contacted me and said, "Don't you dare set foot over there. They'll nab you."
All right. This is going to be frustrating for me because I want to put all of you into one conversation. We'll come to your works of religious history, particularly your recent work, They Flew. But first, the story, your life story, leaving Cuba for the United States. Then and now. Then, Fidel Castro consolidates power in Cuba in the Revolution of 1959. 3 years later, your parents put you and your brother on an airplane bound for Miami. It would be 3 more years before you saw your mother, and you would never see your father again. He died in Havana in 1976. Now, today, the last surviving member of the founding generation of communist Cuba, Raúl Castro, Fidel's younger brother, is 94, and a senior at Yale University, was born a dozen years after the Cold War ended. A question about historical memory. How do you make your students understand? How do you convey that there was once a world in which it made sense for parents to send their children away?
It's not very difficult.
Is that so? Really?
Yeah, because of one item on the list of the things that parents were worried about is that while the airlift was in operation, Cuban children were being sent to the Soviet Union and to Eastern Europe. And there were many grandparents in Cuba of Spanish origin, Spanish immigrants like my grandparents, who remembered what had happened in Spain during the Civil War in the 1930s when Spanish children were sent to the Soviet Union, and most of them never came back again.
Right.
So my parents and the parents of every other Peter Pan cat would have said to their children, explaining what's happening, we don't want you to end up in Russia or Czechoslovakia or East Germany.
And did you understand at the
yes.
age of 11? Oh, you did?
Oh, yeah, I did. I wanted to get out. But of course, children have no ability to reconcile conflicting emotions. So part of me was delighted to leave, even though I was leaving my parents behind, and part of me was terrified. Of course, I thought I would see them again. I thought I would only be in the U.S. for a few months.
Oh, I see. The original idea was that they would recall you when things settled down?
Yes, yeah.
I see.
That the dictatorship would collapse and we would go back. That's what almost every Peter Pan had in mind.
Right.
The other alternative, which was considered very, very, very real and very possible, was for our parents to join us here.
I see.
But some fathers, including mine, were not given permission to leave. There were tens of thousands of families that were intentionally separated because the father would not be given permission to leave.
Carlos, I'm going to quote from Waiting for Snow in Havana. Havana was not in the United States. That was the beauty of it and the horror. There's that split that you're talking about, that divide. For the poor of Cuba, opportunity knocked loudest in the lottery and the numbers racket. For anyone who wasn't poor, life could be beautiful. Now, it feels to me as though popular culture in this country conveys the notion of the poverty and corruption of pre-Castro Cuba. All you have to do is look at Godfather 2.
Yes.
Right? It's there. It's out there. But the notion that there were some people for whom life in Cuba could be beautiful. Could you expand on that?
Yes, and it wasn't just a few people. Cuba had an enormous middle class, one of the largest in Latin America, and it had a very prosperous economy. And that's what many Americans don't realize. But the poor were poor, and especially in the countryside. And I never set foot in the countryside very often. So all I knew was urban poverty. And there was urban poverty. There's poverty in every country, including the United States at that time. So there was an imbalance in the same sense that there's an imbalance in every country on earth. Whether capitalist or communist, there's some other kind of ideologically driven system.
Do you remember, I'm sure you do, the movie Our Man in Havana?
Oh, yes.
Which was shot, I read up on it. It was filmed in Havana on location in 1959, just a few months before Fidel came down from the Sierra Maestre. And so you can see in the background shots the cars, the traffic, the pedestrians, and it looks like a beautiful city.
It was a beautiful city. And most of what people see now is precisely that very same city because very little construction has taken place.
And the same cars.
Plus some Russian Ladas.
Right.
But the fact is that movie, which I've seen several times, Alec Guinness plays the main character, and he's followed throughout Havana by these musicians who are basically performing for money and so on. And I the last two times I watched the movie, I thought, oh my Lord, this is a very British view of what life was like in Cuba. Because of course, the main character is not Cuban.
Right.
So, right. But yeah, that is the Cuba I knew.
in Learning to Die in Miami, you write of a running contest. This comes to sort of the crux. Again, you mentioned it yourself, this division within yourself. You call it a life or death contest between Carlos, the Cuban you were, and Charles, the American you were determined to become. Let me read a couple of excerpts here. When my new foster parents asked me what I'd like to be called, I said Charles. I wanted to fit in. I was hell-bent on becoming an American. Later, Charles has banished Carlos to the grave in which he belongs. Yet Carlos is summoned from the afterlife. Once a week, Carlos is asked to move Charles' hand to pen letters to his parents. On Sundays, no one has to summon Carlos. He simply shows up, takes over Charles, and makes him pedal all the way to church. Okay, so here we have a kid who isn't even a teenager yet, trying to fit into this new life, trying to become Charles. And yet here you sit, 6 decades later, as Carlos. Why?
Well, it was very easy for me to become Charles with my first foster parents because they were American. So they spoke English, they spoke no Spanish. They were Jewish. And I also learned some Yiddish that I thought was English, living in their household. And then I ended up in Bloomington, Illinois, with an uncle after going through 2 different foster homes in Miami. And in Bloomington, Illinois, no one spoke Spanish. And I desperately wanted to remain Charles. And I very quickly became Charlie and then Chuck. Then I got to Chicago, reunited with my mom. And I thought my mom wouldn't like me being Charles. Plus, I went to the high school I attended was euphemistically referred to as the United Nations, because there were so many immigrants and children of immigrants at that school. The principal had a map of the world in his office with pins on it. And Cuba had been blotted off the map because of the number of pins. There were a lot of other, not a lot, I don't mean hundreds, but there was a substantial number of.
So you spoke Spanish?
I spoke Spanish at home, of course, with my mom. She never learned English. But I was Carlos. One Chinese friend of mine was Shu Bin. And there were a lot of Iras, a name I had never run into before, which I thought was foreign, and so on and so forth. Another friend I had was named Ladislav.
So you simply slid back into being Carlos. There was no decision to reclaim your inner identity.
No, I still remained fully committed to being an American, because by that time, late 1965, when I reunited with my mom, nothing was going to change. I was not going to go back.
You knew it.
I knew it. If it hadn't happened yet, it wasn't going to happen. So I made a very deliberate choice, as only a teenager can make it, to completely forget about that past. And I buried it nice and deep.
All right. Let me ask you, may I tell you the story of 2 Cubans? So you have here a total Anglo trying to figure you people out, partly because I'm married to one. So here's the story of one Cuban, my late father-in-law, who left in 1959 right away. He took him about 3 months to figure out what was happening and get out. But he insisted on taking his family to Washington, not Miami. Why? Because there were too many Cubans.
Right.
And he insisted, now they spoke Spanish at home, but he told the children over and over again, you're Americans. And questions about Cuba, going back, no, you're Americans. Very insistent. In fact, he took me aside and said, when I die, make sure they put an American flag over my coffin, which I did. Second story, this is a friend of ours. This is a woman who was in the Pedro Pan program. And this is a lady who has raised children and is now a grandmother many times over, has led a very full life in this country. And not long ago we were chatting and I said, when did you finally give up hoping to go back? And you probably can guess what she said. She said, who said I ever stopped hoping?
Right.
So where is Carlos Eire on this spectrum of no, we're American, and then, still I'm Cuban?
Yeah, well, you know,
how do you think that went through?
Well, that war I describe in Learning to Die between the two was always there. I was very successful for a while as a teenager and a young adult to, anytime the struggle felt a little too tense, I had some mechanism for
you could sort of
submerging it, yeah. And it wasn't until later that Carlos started insisting to be heard. And actually a very, very important turning point for me was when I returned here to Yale.
Oh, really?
At the age of 45. And I met 3 Cuban colleagues here on the faculty, all in the Spanish department, who reawakened my Cuban consciousness simply by talking to me. Mm-hmm. Some in English, some in Spanish. But I think Carlos was ready to just break through the barriers that had been erected for decades. It also had a lot to do with the fact that my mom was aging and ailing. Mm. A lot of these things just came together. But hearing someone speak Spanish with a Cuban accent had always kind of...
Something came back.
Yeah, something would come back.
All right. Yeah. We'll come back to that, but now to your works of history. Your latest book, published in 2023, They Flew, A History of the Impossible. A History of the Impossible. The subtitle is very important there. You describe religious figures of the early modern period who displayed 2 practices in particular: levitation, defying gravity to float or hover in the air, always in a kind of moment of religious intensity. By the way, you make the point that that in the accounts we have, none of them was levitating. They were assumed it was not they but God who was in control. And the other is bilocation, which, if I may say so, is even weirder.
Yeah.
It's being in 2 places at once. And I would like to know how a chaired professor at Yale University, an institution dedicated to the rational, what on earth he thinks he's doing, writing about levitation and bilocation as subjects for serious consideration.
Well, because they're not irrational, these phenomena.
But they
That's
are.
why. But
go ahead.
I am old enough, and I have established a reputation. I can now say what I want without...
So tenure has its uses.
Yes, tenure. That's actually the original purpose of tenure, is for freedom, guaranteeing freedom of speech and freedom of thought.
And Carlos Eire is going to use it.
I'm taking full advantage of it, yeah.
Okay. So I'm flummoxed because so much of what you write about is impossible, but you cite levitation, St. Francis of Assisi, St. Teresa of Avila, St. Joseph of Cupertino for bilocation, St. Teresa once again, St. Joseph of Cupertino again, Maria de Agreda, and striking to me, St. Pio of Pietrelcina,
yes,
who only died in 1968. So we're talking about a man who lived
yes,
post-war into the 60s,
yes,
the time of the hippies, and he's appearing two places at once. All right. So I quote you, how is it that in the 16th and 17th centuries, the very era that gave birth to aggressive skepticism and empirical science of the kind that dominates Yale and major institutions across the country, countless people swore that they had witnessed events such as levitation and bilocation? I'm continuing to quote you. And how is it that some of these sworn testimonies are legal records archived along lawsuits and murder trials from all sorts of people, not just illiterate mudcake peasants, but also elites at the apex of the social, intellectual, and political hierarchy? What sense are we to make of this?
Well, there's the testimony, and that's my point, and that's one of the reasons I can say that this is all very rational. Right? We have these testimonies. And this period in particular, the period I focus on, the 16th and 17th century, is a period where these phenomena were brought up in canonization inquests. And it was a very, very formal procedure, this inquest, two inquests, one for beatification and then one for canonization.
Official bodies of the Catholic Church.
Yes.
Examining evidence, asking questions.
And that's one side of it. That's
Right.
the positive side. The inquest procedure included a questionnaire, pretty much like the questions you have laid out for me, except everyone got exactly the same questionnaire. People who had known this person, or people who had witnessed miracles performed by this person, they had to swear an oath, just as we do in a court of law to this day.
And there was nothing in it for them.
Nothing in it, and even more than that, the penalty for perjury was not a fine or jail time. It was hell.
Right.
Or a long, long, long stint in purgatory. And all these people, 90-some% of them, were deeply religious people who believed in hell and in purgatory. So what's in it for them to lie? And one of the arguments I make in the book is that, if we have similar testimonies from any other kind of procedure where people testify they've seen something, would historians reject them? No, of course not. Of course not. But these get rejected because since the 19th century, in the study of religion, it has been deemed improper to ask the question if these events, impossible events, and the impossible events also include something that happens somewhat frequently, which is unexplainable sudden cures of illnesses that science cannot attribute.
And that's still going on.
That is
we
still
still have
going
it at
on.
Lourdes.
Right.
Right.
It's still going on. So why dismiss this evidence? And why dismiss evidence not just from this time period, but any time period when you have people who are testifying? Now, granted, we don't have videos. We don't have films that I know of any one of any of these reports, except there are a couple of videos I have not yet been able to find where they claim that there's film of Padre Pio in a location where he wasn't, on the date that he wasn't there.
All right.
But I have not been able to get my hands on it.
You've heard about it.
I've heard about
Right.
it, yes. But I think that, the tide is turning because modern science, present-day science, is encountering phenomena that it can't explain according to the older scientific models.
So you note in the book, you write in the book. By the way, the book is very meticulous, and I actually feel a distance between you and the datum that you are presenting. You're very you're overtly maintaining a scholarly remove from all of this. But you note that most of the miracles took place in Italy and Spain, Catholic countries, countries steeped in a sense of the otherworldly, and not in the Protestant world. And so I think here of Matthew 13:58, where Matthew writes of Jesus, and he did not do many miracles there because of their lack of faith, close quote. So is it your argument that only in Catholic countries could people see these miracles? Or is it your argument that only in Catholic countries where faith of a particular kind already existed, these miracles could take place? Do you see the distinction I'm trying to draw?
No, yeah. But the thing is, I mentioned before that there was a positive side. What's the negative side of all this? Of course, it's the devil.
Right.
In this time period, people believed that the devil was capable of lifting people up in the air.
Anything God could do, the devil could mimic, or
yes,
right.
That's right. So, and this is one of the great asymmetries of the Reformation era. Protestants rejected the possibility of any miracle past the first century. A doctrine that's known as the cessation of miracles.
Right. The age of miracles.
Yeah.
Right.
The apostles, Jesus and the apostles were the last to perform miracles. And the reason God did this was to convince people that their message was in fact divine.
Jumpstart the church.
Right.
Right. Okay.
But the asymmetry comes in that Protestants continued to believe that the devil could in fact do all these things, and this had a nice, sharp, polemical edge, which allowed Protestants to say, all of these miracles being claimed by Catholic are demonic. So the argument was not that the Catholic Church had no miracles. Yeah, the Catholic Church had plenty of miracles, but they were all demonic.
And the Pope is the Antichrist and so forth.
That's right.
Right.
And then the happiest moment I had, right in They Flew, is when I finally found a Protestant levitation. 1693, Boston, involving none other than the Puritan divine Cotton Mather.
Really?
Yes, who had been involved in the Salem witch trials.
Yes.
1693, a young girl in Boston is possessed by the devil. And we have several accounts of this. I'll get to that point in a minute. And we have an account of this girl rising up off her bed. Cotton Mather insisting, there were several other men in the room praying over her. Jump on the girl, keep her from going up, and they couldn't. And she went up to the rafters, and they tried to pull her down, and they couldn't. And then Cotton Mather had all these men write and sign affidavits. Right? And if you study just the phenomenon, analyze the phenomenon of what's going on in that room, it is exactly the same phenomenon described in exactly the same way of what happened repeatedly to St. Teresa of Avila, where she had ordered her nuns, if you see me going up, please pull me down. And they're comical scenes. If you look at it from a certain perspective, it's very comical. And Cotton Mather's account is perhaps the most vivid.
By the way, you make the point that St. Teresa of Avila was embarrassed by the whole business.
Oh, yes.
She found it distasteful. Yeah. She prayed for God to knock it off.
Yes. Yes, she did.
Sorry.
As part of my argument is not only that belief does shape the occurrence of these phenomena.
Right.
In this time period, yes, the bad side, well, people are going to court and saying they saw somebody flying and she's a witch. And you find this in Catholic trial records, witch trials, and you find it in Protestant trial records. And as a matter of fact, speaking of humorous things, in England, where there are many fewer witch trials than in Scotland. Scotland was Calvinist and lots of witch trials.
Saw witches everywhere.
The beginning of the end to witch trials in England rests on a court decision. I forget the judge's name, where someone was being tried for witchcraft, and a witness came up and testified, yes, she's a witch. I saw her flying. And the judge's legal decision was, well, there's no law against flying. Skepticism being turned into law.
Right.
Right.
In They Flew, you quote your fellow historian of religion, Jeffrey Kripal, if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, who is at Rice University. This is Kripal now, quoted by you. I cannot tell you how many times I've heard a colleague say, well, it doesn't really matter if Joseph of Cupertino flew up into a tree or if Teresa of Avila floated off the floor. Excuse me, but if either of those things actually happened, they change everything we thought we knew about human consciousness and its relation to physics, gravity, and material reality. And academics don't care?
Yeah.
That's your position.
That's my position. And Jeff is very, very brave and very outspoken, and actually has opened up at Rice University the archives of the impossible.
The archives of the impossible. So, Carlos Eire, I put it to you that although you maintain a cool, calm academic distance from the material you're describing, you're actually extremely subversive, and that your book, They Flew, represents a grenade pitched right into the middle of the whole materialist and skeptical mindset that dominates Yale University and all of American academia.
It's not just Yale.
It's everywhere.
Everywhere, yes.
So you plead. So consider. Nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition, as they say on Monty Python. How do you plead?
I plead guilty. But there is no law against tossing grenades in academia.
More should be tossed, in my opinion.
And yes, but you know, the book has elicited anger, perhaps even disgust. Review that was published in the New York Review of Books begins with the following sentence: "This is a deeply unserious book."
No, it isn't. No, it isn't.
I don't think so.
All right. I'm going to try to put a few things together, although I confess that I'm indulging myself because this is something, again, Anglo here, married to a Cuban, that I've been trying to figure out for a long time. What does it mean to be a Hispanic in America today? And what does it mean for America? So let me give you a couple of statistics. I looked this stuff up to figure it out. When you came to this country in 1962, Hispanics made up 4% of the population. And today that figure is 20%.
Damn.
One, not 4 in 100, but 1 in 5. Another statistic here. In the 1970s, per capita annual black bean consumption in the United States, frijoles negros, was a negligible 1/10 of 1 pound. Today, that figure has risen to 1.5 pounds.
Yes.
We live in a new America. And the conflict that you write about, Carlos versus Charles, 2 different identities, 2 different modes of being, one Hispanic, the other in America, shaped by Northern Europe, that conflict has become national.
Yes. Yes, when I lived in Bloomington, Illinois, we had no black beans. The only thing that close to it was Campbell's made black bean soup, which was all liquid. It had no beans.
That is not frijoles negros.
No. So, yes, things have changed. And I remember a little girl at Woolworth's in Bloomington, Illinois. She must have been about 5 or 6, standing there with her mouth wide open when she heard us speaking Spanish. I don't think that happens in Bloomington any longer. They have a very, very large Hispanic population.
Of course.
So, yeah, Hispanics are here. And
so I'm trying to figure this out. What does it mean for America? How should we... This is all very crude because this is about as far as I've ever been able to get with it. But you being you, you'll be able to take it farther. On the one hand, it's possible, I think actually historically almost necessary if you want to be comprehensive, to think of a dual founding. We have here in New England, the British, that's the story we all know, the Declaration of Independence in 1776. But at the same time, in California, we've got the founding of Mission San Francisco de Asís on October 9th, 1776. But there is a dual founding of this country, as all the Spanish names I come from Palo Alto and Santa Clara, yes, on and on. So on the one hand, we have this whole nation, the Spanish, the Hispanic influence is actually present from the moment of creation.
Right.
I think that's true. On the other hand, let me quote the late Samuel Huntington, I think regarded as one of the leading, if not the leading, political scientist of the 20th century. This is from Huntington's 2004 book, Who Are We? Quote, "Would the United States be the country that it has been, and that it largely remains today, if it had been settled in the 17th and 18th centuries, not by British Protestants, but by Spanish Catholics? The answer is no. It would not be the United States, it would be Mexico." So we've got this, there are good bits and bad bits.
Well, there's the culture. See, there's two things
Okay.
going on. One is ethnic, national identity, all rolled up into this catch-all term, Hispanic. Why are there so many different nations that are Hispanic? Because they're each very different from each other.
Mm.
And there's tension between them, culturally and so on. But there's also culture. All the previous waves of immigrants, not from the British Isles. Well, no, let's include the Irish.
All right.
They came here, the English were here. They adapted to the English way of thinking about politics, about economy. And there's something about it. If you look at the former British Empire, the nations where the English tradition became dominant, are all very prosperous and very democratic nations. Canada,
Right.
Australia, New Zealand.
And the genius there is for institutions of governance, free markets. Is this correct?
Yes. Yeah. And also the fact that the Protestant Reformation had the most extensive reach in England of any country, because simply the variety of Protestantisms that emerged in England and Scotland.
Methodist, Presbyterians, Church of England, on and on.
And then
Quakers.
during the Puritan Commonwealth. Yeah, Quakers, there were all these radical groups.
Right.
And then this moves here.
Founding Yale University, apart from
Yes.
anything else.
And actually, Yale was founded because of a theological dispute with the faculty at Harvard. They were getting a little too un-Calvinist. So, anyway, freedom of expression, freedom of religion, respect for living with the other, and having some kind of umbrella over the whole thing, agreement.
that lets
We
us
will
get on with
tolerate,
each other.
yes, let's tolerate each other. Plus all these things about property and democracy and the institutions that are set up to defend democracy. This comes right out of the English heritage of the United States.
And that we want to retain.
Absolutely.
All right.
And as a matter of fact, just about every Hispanic I know, That's what they love about the United States.
Right.
That's why they come here. That's why we come here.
Right.
Because our ancestors were not able to duplicate that. It could not be duplicated in Spanish colonies. It simply could not. So yeah, Huntington is right about
That much.
that much. That
But is there a peculiar, so, I mean, here's where I go back to your book, They Flew. The implicit assertion is that the Catholic Latin cultures in which these miracles took place were in some way, these were not hysterical, they were not imagining things, they were in some way more open to reality, to the variety of reality, to this, the universe that we inhabit is so big and so surprising that it has room for levitation and bilocation. And it's real, it is part of reality. Yeah. And that particular culture can see it. And the Anglo culture says, no, we'd rather not, turn away. So there's something there that would make the country richer. There's a specific Hispanic genius, isn't there, or not?
There is. But when you say Anglo, that's another umbrella term that covers a lot, right? All right. It covers a lot of different things, because there were English Catholics.
True.
And there remains to be English Catholics for whom this is all right, possible. And there are, I can think of, for instance, this French nun. So in France, which was religiously divided, and the religious divisions are ultimately responsible for the French Revolution and the horrors of the French Revolution, was the fact that France had been a religiously divided nation in which they couldn't figure out the tolerance thing, right, the way that England did.
Right.
Yvonne Aimée de Maletroit, family name Beauvais, Yvonne Aimée Beauvais, French nun who lived between 1901 and 1951. There are at least 800 verifiable testimonies of her bilocating. So this is 20th century, and it's France. And the reason I'm bringing this up is that
she hadn't got the memo. This was not supposed to happen.
No, but there's one curious thing about this case that I find remarkable, and it has something to do about your comment and question about Anglo culture. Even though she died in 1951, and there are dozens of books on her in French, not one of them has been translated into English. Why? And why didn't I hear about this nun until like 3 or 4 years ago? Because I'm Catholic. I should have heard about her. But no. So the openness, this openness you speak of, this cultural openness to these phenomena does exist in pockets. But you're right. There's a kind of a culturally driven antipathy, right, in North American, European, Australian, New Zealand,
right,
an antipathy to these alternative views, having alternative views on reality.
Of reality itself.
Of reality itself, yeah.
Back to Cuba, if we may, and 2 statistics again. I did the best I could to find rankings that seemed to me to be valid. Ranking countries in Latin America and the Caribbean according to living standards. At the time of the 1959 revolution, Cuba ranked 2nd from the top, behind only Venezuela, which had already begun to benefit from oil revenues. Today, Cuba ranks 2nd from the bottom. It's only ahead of Haiti.
Right.
So congratulations, Fidel. Now let me give you a quotation and see what you make of it. This is Harvard political scientist Graham Allison, who wrote an essay on the 50th anniversary of Fidel's 1959 speech at Harvard Stadium. I'm quoting Allison, quote, "Noticeably absent from Castro's entire American tour was any hint of admiration for Soviet communism. Would Cuba have clung so tenaciously to dictatorial communism had Washington sought to engage instead of isolate?" Oh, you're giving your answer already. "Instead of isolate Castro and the Cuban people." Carlos.
It's a form of insanity. And it's a very, very kind of devious insanity, because I'm sure whoever this person was.
Oh, no. Graham Allison is still with us, the major figure at Harvard.
Well, I can't account for his devious kind of stupidity. It's like looking at evidence and the redacted document that you get from the CIA with all the things blacked out.
All the good stuff blacked out.
That's what he's doing. Fidel didn't shrink back from praising the Soviet Union. Maybe he didn't mention it at Harvard in 1959 because he was still telling people he wasn't a communist. The United States had no way to engage with a government whose primary purpose was to disengage with the United States and become its enemy. That was at the very top of the list of what the Cuban dictatorship was all about. So, and I get this all the time. I attended a lecture at the University of Illinois in 1968 where I had to sit and listen to a sociologist who had just come back from Cuba say, in Cuba they have completely erased poverty and racism. Why can't we do that here in the United States? And I had to laugh, especially because I know that the entire leadership of the Cuban dictatorship at that time was as white can be and as racist can be.
Right.
And that poverty, how do you measure that? How do you measure the elimination of poverty in a country where everything, at that time in 1968, absolutely everything was rationed? So, I have to laugh.
One more question then about you. Yes, you've made your view clear on that. On one issue after another, our relationship with our NATO allies, our trading arrangements with the rest of the world, President Trump is sweeping away the old Cold War order. On Cuba, our embargo against Cuba was instituted by John Fitzgerald Kennedy.
Yeah.
Is it time for that to be swept away as well?
No. And there is no embargo. Well, point number one, the embargo is a policy for containing the damage that the Cuban dictatorship can do to the United States, because the Cuban government is dead set on, it's allied with all of the worst enemies of the United States. And it continues to have this rhetoric, and that rhetoric actually is not a cover. The rhetoric discloses what their primary objective is, which is to destroy the United States. So that's item number one. Number two, Cuba can buy whatever it wants from the United States. The embargo only means one thing. Cuba can buy cash purchases only. No credit. Cuba cannot buy on credit. Cuba has defaulted on all the loans offered to it by every country on earth. And it owes so many billions of dollars or dollar equivalents that no one knows for sure how much has gone unpaid. Their loans always get restructured to pennies on the dollar.
Right.
The United States is protecting American taxpayers from Cuba. Why? Oh, taxpayers, wait a minute, what? If farmers were to sell food to Cuba on credit and never got paid, would the agriculture department allow them all to go bankrupt? No. The agriculture department would come to their rescue.
We'd end up subsidizing the Cubans, essentially. Yeah.
So that's something that most Americans do not understand.
Carlos, could I put the similar question but turn it a little bit? Here's another aspect of John Fitzgerald Kennedy's policy toward Cuba that remains in place. As part of the resolution of the Cuban Missile Crisis, Kennedy promised the Soviets,
hands off.
Hands off. We won't invade again. We'll leave them alone. And that, in one way or another, has remained American policy. Ronald Reagan, we had Radio Martí, sort of Voice of America broadcast. We're sending radio signals to Cuba. Is it time for the United States to get tough on 94-year-old Fidel Castro? Somehow or other to make it our policy to see regime change?
Well,
or we just let this continue decade after decade?
I don't, other than invading Cuba, I don't see anything that the U.S. could do.
All right.
And that is not going to happen, and it would not be a good thing.
All right.
I think the system is going to collapse from within, but what emerges after the collapse is shrouded in mystery because we don't know. There are, latest estimate I saw, it's like 3 million Cubans in exile. What if just the percentage of those Cubans who have lived elsewhere and know how the capitalist world operates, the democratic nations of the world operate, what if just let's say 10-15% return with all this knowledge?
Knowledge and capital. Cubans have done well in this country. They could transform that country.
So it'll take a long time because the country has been destroyed, physically destroyed by neglect. So I don't know. I won't live long enough to see any such change happen. So
don't say that. You never know. You never know.
Well, yeah. Maybe if I live to be 95,
you're in a lot better shape than Raul. Let's put it that way.
Well, let's see. Right. He has relatives who live to be over 100. That's
So, to return to the theme that runs through They Flew, this tension between the Catholic and Protestant worldviews. There are some statistics that show Americans entering the Church of Rome becoming Catholic in growing numbers. Here are some statistics I found reported last year in the National Catholic Register. The Diocese of Des Moines, an increase in converts in 2023 to 2024 of 87%, Diocese of Trenton 53%, Archdiocese of Houston 50%, and on and on. Here's Alexis de Tocqueville writing in 1840. America is the most democratic land on earth, and it is at the same time the country where, according to trustworthy reports, the Catholic religion is making the most progress. If Catholicism finally succeeded in escaping from political hatreds, I hardly doubt that all at once it would make great conquests. Was Tocqueville onto something? Is something happening? Do you see it among your students, or are the numbers so tiny that it's just
I had never heard that quote from Tocqueville, so I'm surprised by it. That's why if I look...
Well, but you'd also never heard of the nun in France who was...
Yeah, well, that's true. Yeah, one learns new things. But I think what's happening has many contributing factors to it, and it depends on where you're looking and what is happening. And what's happening at, let's say, here in New Haven might be different from what is happening in Des Moines. But the fact is that the major Protestant denominations in the United States are not the same that they were when I came here in 1962.
They've become progressive.
Their theology has morphed, and their political theology, their political thinking has also morphed in a way that has made their memberships dwindle. And I know, for instance, that while one branch of the Presbyterian Church is more conservative theologically, has actually continually grown since 1963. Another branch of the Presbyterian Church that embraced theological and political social liberalism of the kind we now call woke, their membership keeps shrinking. So when I mention New Haven, here's a startling statistic here at Yale. I don't know what the first year or freshman class was this year or the previous year, but going back 3 years, for over a decade, first year students are given a questionnaire. Back to questionnaire.
Yes.
Are you religious? Yes or no? If you're religious, then you get a choice of little boxes to tick. So if you're religious, what are you?
Mm-hmm.
Of students who mark, yes, they are religious, for over a decade, 25% Catholic, 25% Jewish. So that's 50% of the incoming classes who label themselves religious were people who would have been excluded from Yale in 1962.
Of course.
Or would have had to really serve some kind of very important function like the football team to be, or William F. Buckley, for instance, is an exception to the rule. But this is very much part of his book, God and Man at Yale, is how his Catholicism was a problem here.
Another couple of questions. Robert Prevost, who grew up in Dalton, a suburb of Chicago, the city in which you yourself lived and studied for many years, is now Leo XIV, Pontifex Maximus Pastor Pastorum, an American pope who spent 20 years in Peru. So what does Carlos Eire hope to see from this papacy? An American who deeply understands the Latin world.
Yeah, I always take a very, very detached position. Like if I'm sitting, I'm leaning back with this one. I lean back with all of them until I see who they are. So I'm hoping that Leo will stay rooted in the 2,000 years of tradition and theology and belief. That's the most important thing. As a matter of fact, I saw some survey where a lot of these young people who are converting to Catholicism here in the United States, what attracts them the most to the Catholic Church is precisely this. It's continuity. The fact that it's thinking on very key issues remains steady. You can trace it back with, certainty. So I'm hoping this. I'm also hoping that somehow he manages to navigate all of the countercurrents that exist within the Catholic Church without creating any divisions, which is always the hard line that every pope at one point or another faces. Where do you cross this line? Or am I going to cause some kind of rupture by crossing a line? But he seems to me so far in the few months that he has been pope that he is pretty much more like Benedict XVI than Francis.
And we're relieved at that.
Well, Francis had a very annoying habit for Cubans. He was very friendly with the Castro brothers, never said anything, no criticism. But it wasn't just the Castro brothers. Francis was very much a liberation theologian. Right? Liberation theology is a form of Christian Marxism. Francis would never say anything negative about leftist dictatorships in Latin America, his own continent.
Right.
But whenever you went to free democratic capitalist countries, he would always have all sorts of criticisms about capitalism. So that was very annoying to Cubans.
It was annoying to some,
and
some non-Cubans as well. Last question. Suppose we have a young high school student or college student listening to this interview whose name is Juana or Pilar or Pedro or Carlos. As this country approaches its 250th anniversary, next July is the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, how should Juana or Carlos see the United States, this country? What has life here meant to you?
Well, it's a place that rewards your potential.
It still works?
It still works. It still works, and it opens up all sorts of avenues for your potential to become reality. It requires playing by the rules. I have to admit that things have changed since 1962, in that none of these young people who would be the age of the people you've just mentioned can't afford to buy a house.
Mm-hmm.
Something has gone wrong, and it's a very, very big thing in the American economy, in that, yes, the opportunities have shrunk, but still, compared to the rest of the world,
right?
Compared to the rest of the world, this remains to be a place where you can. Yes, you can. But it requires sacrifice.
Carlos Eire, would you close our conversation by reading a passage from your memoir, Waiting for Snow in Havana?
Sure. In the past 38 years, I've seen 8,917 clouds in the shape of the island of Cuba. I know this because I keep count, and the number is always etched accurately in my brain and in my heart. When I die, feel free to saw open my skull and paw through my brain. I bet you'll find a spot that looks like a cloud in the shape of Cuba. Feel free to open my chest too. I bet you'll also find a scar on my heart that looks like a Cuba cloud. You accuse me of making this up, or worse, of being insane? Okay, yeah, I'll admit it. I'm making up the exact number. I don't really keep count. Who could? I see them all the time, though. As to being nuts, well, maybe I am, but not in the way you think. I saw one of those Cuba clouds this afternoon on my way home from work, hovering over the highway. If you'd been in the car with me, I could have pointed it out to you, and you would have been forced to say, "My God, you're right." The first time I saw one of these clouds was in the Pedro Pan refugee camp for kids who had come to the States without their parents in Homestead, Florida. There we were, sitting outside the dining hall, another newly minted orphan and I, our backs against the chain-link fence. And this other kid says to me, "You know, clouds in Cuba were so much prettier." "Nah, you're just homesick," was my reply.
Carlos Eire, professor of history at Yale and author of Waiting for Snow in Havana and They Flew, A History of the Impossible. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
For Uncommon Knowledge, the Hoover Institution, and Fox Nation, I'm Peter Robinson.